that feeling when something in your campsite isn't quite how you left it? Not obviously wrong, just different? That's how it started for me. Small changes I could almost convince myself I was imagining. Almost. Until I couldn't ignore them anymore. I'd been planning this solo camping trip for months. After my divorce, I needed to prove to myself I could still do things alone. The Cascade Mountains in late September seemed perfect. Just cold enough to keep the summer crowds away, but not so cold I'd freeze in my 3-season tent. The first day went exactly as planned. I found a perfect spot about 3 miles from the trailhead, far enough to feel secluded, but not so remote I'd be completely cut off. My little clearing had everything: flat ground, a natural windbreak, and even a babbling creek nearby. I set up my tent, arranged my camp kitchen on a flat rock, and stacked my firewood in a neat pile under a tarp. That first night, I felt proud of myself. Sitting by my fire, sipping hot chocolate spike with whiskey, I thought I'd finally found my footing again. The stars were incredible. The kind of stars you only see when you're miles from civilization, spreading across the sky like scattered diamonds. The trouble started the next morning. I'd planned a day hike to a nearby lake, and I'd left my camp set up. Nothing valuable, just my tent, my tarp-covered firewood, and some heavy cooking gear. When I returned that afternoon, something felt off. The firewood pile had shifted, not knocked over like an animal had gotten into it, rearranged. The logs I'd carefully stacked like a lumber yard were now in a perfect pyramid. I stood there for several minutes, just staring at it. Had I stacked them that way? No. I specifically remembered doing it differently because I'd been thinking about how my ex used to criticize my messy wood piles. I told myself it was probably just other hikers passing through, maybe thinking they were being helpful. But a voice in the back of my head whispered that I hadn't seen another soul on the trail all day. That night, every snapping twig made me jump. I kept my headlamp close, scanning the tree line whenever I heard a noise. But nothing seemed amiss, and eventually, exhaustion won out over anxiety. The second day, I decided to explore some nearby caves. When I returned, my camp chair had been moved from beside the fire pit to facing my tent. My cooking pots, which I'd left drying on a log, were stacked neatly by my bear canister. A bundle of wildflowers sat on top of my cooler. My heart was pounding as I looked around the clearing. This wasn't random. Someone was clearly visiting my campsite while I was away. I considered packing up right then, but something stopped me. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was that same need to prove something to myself that had brought me out here in the first place. I decided to cut my hike short the next day. Instead of going all the way to the ridge I'd planned to climb, I doubled back after an hour, taking a different route back to my campsite. As I approached, I heard voices, young voices, crouching behind a fallen tree. I watched as 3 kids, probably around 12 or 13, crept around my campsite. They moved with the exaggerated stealth of children playing spy, giggling and shushing each other as they rearranged my camp chairs and res-tacked my firewood. "Make it perfect," one whispered loudly, like forest spirits would do it. "She's gonna freak out when she gets back," another said, carefully placing pine cones in a spiral pattern around my tent. "Maybe she'll write about it in her journal again," the third added. "Did you see what she wrote yesterday? She thinks we're Bigfoot or something." I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing. The forest spirits were just local kids who'd been playing an elaborate game. As I watched them work, I couldn't help but admire their creativity. They weren't damaging anything. They were just creating little mysteries. I waited until they finished their work and started to leave before I made my presence known. Clearing my throat, I stepped out from my hiding spot. You know, if you're trying to be forest spirits, you might want to work on being a little quieter. They froze like deer in headlights, faces flushing red. The tallest one, a girl with braided hair, found her voice first. We weren't stealing anything. We just thought it would be fun to make some magic." I finished for her, smiling. "You know, You had me going there for a while. Their terror gradually turned to embarrassment, then curiosity, when they realized I wasn't angry. We ended up sitting around my campfire as they explained how they lived in a small community about a mile away. They'd been playing this game all summer, creating little mysteries for campers. Most people never stayed long enough to notice the patterns. We like making stories, the youngest boy explained, accepting a hot chocolate from me. Mom says we watch too many YouTube videos about forest mysteries, but we thought, maybe we could make some ourselves? I had to admire their imagination. Instead of fighting them off or packing up in fear, I'd stumbled into being part of their story. We made a deal. They could keep visiting my camp while I was there, but only if they'd teach me how they made those perfect wood pyramids. For the rest of my stay, I had the strangest camping experience of my life. Every day I'd go hiking, knowing I'd return to some new artistic arrangement. Sometimes they'd leave little treasures, interesting rocks, beautifully arranged leaves, or intricate structures made from fallen branches. We'd share hot chocolate in the evenings, and they'd tell me about all the other campers they'd mystified over the summer. When I finally packed up to leave, I found one last surprise, a handmade card tucked into my tent flap. "Thanks for being cool about our forest spirit game," it read. "Most grown-ups just get scared and leave." Looking back now, I realize those kids gave me exactly what I'd come to the wilderness to find, not just solitude, but magic. Sometimes the strangest encounters in the woods aren't with wildlife or weather or weird loners. Sometimes they're with three creative kids who remind you how to see wonder in the world again. I still camp at that spot sometimes. And if I sometimes find my firewood rearranged or flowers placed on my cooler, well, I just smile and thank the forest spirits. You ever get that feeling someone's following the same path you are? Not just by coincidence, but deliberately matching your every move? Let me tell you about the man with the blue backpack and how a simple 7-day hiking trip turned into the most unnerving week of my life. I've been planning this trek along the Pacific Crest Trail for months. Just a short section, about 70 miles through Northern California's Trinity Alps. Remote enough to feel like a real adventure, but popular enough that I wouldn't be completely alone out there. Or so I thought. I noticed him first at the trailhead parking lot. Tall, probably mid-50s, with a distinctive bright blue backpack that looked brand new. He was studying a map when I started up the trail, and I didn't think much of it. Lots of hikers start their day at 7 a.m. Nothing weird about that. That first night, I made camp at Bear Creek, a popular spot about 12 miles in. Just as I was setting up my tent, I spotted that same blue backpack. Its owner had set up camp across the creek, maybe 200 yards away. Still, nothing unusual. It's a well-known stopping point. The next morning, I took my time breaking camp, enjoying my coffee and watching the sunrise paint the mountains gold. I hadn't seen Blue Backpack break camp, but about 2 hours into my hike, I spotted him ahead on the trail. He was walking at exactly my pace, maintaining the same distance. When I stopped for lunch, I could see him stop too, far ahead on a switchback. By the third day, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Every campsite I chose, he would appear shortly after, always keeping that same distance. If I stopped at a viewpoint, I'd spot that blue backpack in the distance, also stopped. If I took a break, he took a break. When I checked my map, I'd see him doing the same. On day 4, I decided to test my growing paranoia. I took an unmarked side trail to a hidden alpine lake, something only mentioned in obscure hiking forums. It added 3 miles to my day, but I had to know. Sure enough, as I set up camp by the crystal clear water, I spotted him making his way around the lake's far shore. That bright blue backpack, like a beacon against the darkening sky. My hands shook as I cooked dinner that night. This couldn't be coincidence anymore. I kept my bear spray close and barely slept, listening to every snap of every twig. The next morning, I waited until he started hiking, then quickly packed up and followed him for a change. When he realized I was behind him, He suddenly needed to retie his boots. He waited until I passed, then fell right back into his routine. Same distance, same pace. By day 6, I'd had enough. I stopped in the middle of the trail and waited. He'd have to pass me or turn around. Instead, he just stopped too, barely visible through the trees. We stayed there for almost an hour, this bizarre standoff in the wilderness. Finally, I shouted out, "Hey, blue backpack, what's your deal?" He startled like I'd shocked him, then slowly approached. Up close, he looked ordinary enough. Weathered face, gray hair, expensive hiking gear. "I'm just following the trail guide," he said, pulling out a glossy booklet. "What trail guide?" I asked. I knew this section well. There wasn't any official guide for the specific route. "This one," he said, holding it up. Trinity Alps Traverse was printed across the top, with my exact itinerary listed day by day. My blood ran cold when I saw the publication date, 3 days before I started my hike. "That's impossible," I said. "That's my exact route. I planned it myself." "Where did you get that?" He looked confused and concerned. "Got it at the ranger station. The ranger recommended it specifically. Said it was a perfect 7-day trek. He handed me the guide. The pages were pristine, like they'd never been opened. Every detail of my planned hike was there, even the obscure alpine lake. But something else caught my eye. The publisher's address was listed as my home address. "This is my address," I said, my voice shaking. "I never published any guide. This isn't real." The color drained from his face as he looked at where I was pointing. He took off his backpack, that bright blue beacon I'd been following for days, and showed me the tag. The ranger gave me this too, said it was required for the guided route. The tag had my name on it, not as the owner, as the manufacturer, a company I'd never heard of, supposedly based at my home address. We stood there in stunned silence, two strangers in the wilderness, trying to make sense of it. He pulled out his permit, issued just 3 hours before mine, by a ranger neither of us could clearly remember. The more we talked, the less anything made sense. That night, we made camp together, too unnerved to be alone. We compared notes, checked maps, called up old emails on our phones despite the weak signal. Nothing added up. My original permit was gone from my pack, though I knew I'd packed it. His trail guide vanished sometime in the night, and in the morning, his backpack was just plain black. We hiked out together that last day, watching the shadows between the trees. At the ranger station, we asked about the trail guide and the blue backpack. They had no record of either, no record of his permit, no record of mine, just two hikers who'd happened to follow the same route. I still hike that trail sometimes, but now I always check the ranger station's publications first. And if I ever see someone with a bright blue backpack following my exact route, keeping that same perfect distance, well, I think I'll choose a different trail. The strangest part? When I got home, I looked at my address in old property records. Turns out in the 1950s, it was briefly registered as a business location. The name of that business? Blue Peak Trail Guides. Some people say hiking is about getting away from it all. But sometimes, out there in the wilderness, the mysteries you're trying to escape just end up following you instead, at exactly the same pace, keeping exactly the same distance, until you finally turn around and face them. They say curiosity killed the cat. In our case, it nearly got us killed in the mountains of New Mexico. When you stumble across a duffel bag full of cash in the wilderness, there's only one smart thing to do: walk away. We didn't. My buddy Marcus and I have been planning this desert camping trip for months. Both of us worked soul-crushing corporate jobs in Phoenix, and we needed an escape. The Gila National Forest seemed perfect, remote, beautiful, and far from any cell phone service. We'd picked a spot near an old Forest Service road, about 15 miles from the nearest pavement. The first sign something was off came during setup. We found empty water bottles scattered around. Not your typical hiker's bottles, but generic store-brand gallons, dozens of them. Some had Spanish writing. Marcus joked about thirsty border crossers, but we were too far north of that. Still, something felt wrong about the place. We almost picked a different spot, but the sun was setting and we'd been driving dirt roads for hours. The site was perfect otherwise, elevated with good views, flat ground for the tents, and plenty of pinyon pines for shelter. So we stayed. That first night, we kept hearing vehicles in the distance, but never saw headlights. Just a low rumble of engines. Always after midnight, always coming from the south and heading north. We figured it was Forest Service doing night patrols. We were wrong. On our second morning, we decided to gather firewood. That's when I found the bag. It was military style, olive drab, partially covered with dead branches behind a large boulder about 50 yards from our camp. When I unzipped it, I thought I was hallucinating. Bound stacks of cash, dozens of them, all hundreds. Marcus, I hissed, waving him over. Look at this. His eyes went wide. Holy shit, that's got to be, what, $1 million? At least, I whispered, though there was nobody around for miles. What do we do? That's when we had our first real argument as friends. Marcus wanted to take it, hide it somewhere else, and come back with a rental car later. I wanted to leave it exactly as we found it and get the hell out. While we were debating, we heard an engine in the distance. Midday this time, we quickly covered the bag and hustled back to our camp. A dirty white pickup truck drove slowly past our turnoff, then stopped. A man got out and seemed to be checking the ground for tracks. He never looked our way, but my heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. We need to leave, I said after the truck disappeared. Now, Marcus agreed, but as we started packing up, another vehicle approached from the opposite direction. We dove into our tents, trying to look normal. This time it was a black SUV with tinted windows. It stopped right at our turnoff. 2 men got out. They looked like hikers, expensive outdoor gear, trekking poles, the works. But something was off. Their boots were too clean. Their backpacks looked empty. "Hey there," one called out, walking over. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "You guys been here long." "Just got here this morning." Marcus lied smoothly. "Something wrong?" "Oh no, just checking camping spots for next weekend," the man said. His partner was scanning the area, paying particular attention to the boulder where we'd found the bag. "You haven't seen anyone else around, have you?" We shook our heads. They chatted for another minute, asked if we'd seen any wildlife, then left. As soon as they were gone, we looked at each other and started throwing our gear into the truck. That's when we heard more vehicles approaching. Lots of them. "Leave it," I said as Marcus grabbed for his tent. "Just get in." We peeled out just as 3 more trucks came into view behind us. No headlights, even though the sun was setting. In my rear-view mirror, I saw men pouring out of the vehicles, running toward our campsite. The next hour was the scariest of my life. We bounced down that Forest Service road at dangerous speeds, afraid to hit the main highway in case they were waiting, but more afraid to stay in the wilderness. Every set of headlights made my heart stop. We finally made it to a small town and pulled into a brightly lit gas station. We were filthy, shaking, and had left half our camping gear behind, but we were alive. Later that night, safely in a motel room 2 towns over, we watched local news coverage about a major drug bust in the Gila National Forest. The reporter stood in front of our abandoned campsite, talking about how law enforcement had intercepted a cartel smuggling route. They'd seized drugs, weapons, and significant amounts of cash. The camera panned across the scene. I recognized the boulder where we'd found the bag. Yellow evidence markers dotted the ground. The reporter mentioned that civilian campers had unknowingly helped break the case by reporting suspicious activity. Marcus and I looked at each other and silently agreed we'd never tell anyone the real story. I still go camping, but not in that part of New Mexico. Sometimes I think about that bag of cash, about how close we came to doing something stupid. Marcus bought a lottery ticket the next day, said we'd used up all our bad luck and we're due for some good. He didn't win. The thing about finding money in the wilderness, it always belongs to someone. And that someone probably isn't the kind of person you want knowing your name, or your face, or which tent is yours when night falls in the middle of nowhere. I read later that particular Forest Service road had been a smuggling route for years. The cartels used backpackers as cover. Their lookouts would dress like hikers, their cargo hidden under camping gear. The really scary part? Those guys in the SUV weren't law enforcement. The real cops showed up hours later. We'd stumbled into the middle of a cartel operation and then a federal sting, all because we wanted to get away from our corporate jobs for a weekend. Now, when I go camping, I stick to crowded state parks. Sometimes boring is better than interesting. Sometimes the most valuable thing you can find in the wilderness is a clean exit. Ever had your tent slashed open in the middle of the night? That ripping sound that jolts you awake, knowing something wants in, and you're just a thin piece of nylon away from whatever it is? Let me tell you about the night I learned why they say to never keep food in your tent. I'd been camping plenty of times before, always played it safe. But my girlfriend Sarah was new to it, and I wanted her first trip to be perfect. That's why I ignored the warning signs. That's why I made exceptions to rules I knew better than to break. We picked a spot in the Ozarks late October. The weather was perfect, crisp days, cool nights, fall colors everywhere. The campsite was about a mile from the parking area, just far enough to feel secluded, but close enough that Sarah wouldn't get overwhelmed on her first backpacking trip. Everything started perfectly. We set up our tent on a flat spot with a view of the valley. Sarah was thrilled about cooking over the campfire, and I wanted to keep that excitement going. When she worried about bears getting into our food, I assured her we were fine. This wasn't grizzly country, after all. That first night, we made the mistake that almost got us killed. We'd brought these amazing steaks, packed in with dry ice. After cooking them, the packaging still smelled amazing. Sarah was worried about attracting animals to our bear bag hanging area, and I, trying to be the comforting boyfriend, suggested we just keep the wrapped garbage in the tent vestibule. Just for tonight, I said. It'll be fine. The temperature dropped faster than we expected. We zipped our sleeping bags together and fell asleep to the sound of distant owls. I remember thinking how perfect it all was. The first slash came around 3 a.m. It was a sound like nothing I'd ever heard before, a deep, angry ripping noise followed by Sarah's scream. Something large was tearing through the side of our tent, right by our feet. In the confusion, I couldn't find my headlamp. Sarah was gripping my arm so tight it hurt. That's when we heard the snuffling. Heavy breathing just inches away, separated by what remained of our tent wall. A sharp, musky smell filled the air. Sarah whispered, "What is it?" Before I could answer, another slash tore through the tent, this time near our heads. In the dim moonlight filtering through the tears, I caught a glimpse of coarse, dark hair and a massive shoulder. Not a bear, something lower to the ground but just as powerful. "Wild hog," I whispered. "Don't move." The boar, and I could tell now it was a big one, was systematically destroying our tent, drawn by the smell of those damn steak wrappers. Each rip was deliberate, methodical. These weren't the random actions of a curious animal. This was a predator that knew exactly what it wanted and where to find it. Sarah was shaking uncontrollably. I knew we had to move, but the animal was between us and the tent door. Another slash, closer this time. The breathing got louder. I could feel the animal's presence like a physical weight. Then, in a moment of either clarity or insanity, I remembered the emergency flares in my pack. With movements so slow they barely felt real, I reached for my backpack. The hog froze, sensing the movement. Its breathing got faster, more aggressive. I felt the flare at the bottom of my pack. The boar chose that moment to make its final move, tearing a hole big enough to force its way inside. In the moonlight, I saw tusks gleaming. Sarah screamed. I struck the flare. The sudden burst of red light and smoke sent the animal scrambling backward. I could see it clearly now, easily 300 pounds, with tusks like curved knives. It charged away from the flare's sparks, crashing through the underbrush. We didn't wait to see if it would return. Grabbing only our essential gear, we abandoned the shredded tent and ran. The mile back to the car felt like 10. Every snapping twig sounded like pursuing hooves. Every shadow looked like a charging boar. When we finally reached the parking area, we found our car. As we drove away, hands still shaking, we saw other headlights pulling in, park rangers responding to reports of the flare. The next day, we returned with the rangers to collect our remaining gear. The campsite looked like a war zone. Our tent was shredded beyond recognition. The rangers found tracks everywhere, not just from one boar, but an entire sounder. We'd unknowingly set up camp near a wild hog trail, and that meat smell had drawn them right to us. "You're lucky," one ranger said, pointing out the size of the tracks. "These aren't your typical farm pigs. These are wild boar. They'll go through anything to get the food, and they're not afraid of people." He showed us other destroyed campsites from that week. Apparently, the hogs had been getting bolder, learning that tents often meant easy meals. Our steak wrappers were just the latest in a string of poor decisions by campers that had taught these animals to associate tents with food. Sarah never went camping again. Can't say I blame her. Me? I still camp, but now I'm religious about food storage. Every time I hear someone say they'll just keep their food close by, I tell them about the night I learned why wild hogs are considered one of the most dangerous animals in North America. The rangers eventually had to relocate that entire sounder of hogs. They become too comfortable around humans, too aggressive. But sometimes, when I'm camping and I hear something moving through the brush at night, I remember the sound of that first slash, the way the fabric tore so easily, the realization that everything we think of as shelter is really just an illusion. They say you should never keep food in your tent. They're right, but they never tell you just how terrifying it is to learn that lesson firsthand. In the middle of the night, with nothing but a thin sheet of nylon between you and 300 pounds of determined wild boar. Now I carry 2 extra things when I camp, better food storage gear and an extra flare, because sometimes the most dangerous things in the woods aren't the ones you're warned about. They're the ones that have learned to see your tent as a food wrapper waiting to be opened. You know those perfectly balanced stone stacks you see on Instagram? The ones that look impossible, defying gravity in some picturesque wilderness spot? I used to love those. Used to photograph them myself. That was before my solo camping trip in Colorado. Before I learned why some people call them trail stalkers. I'd taken 2 weeks off work to hike and camp in the San Juan Mountains. As a nature photographer, I was after those perfect golden hour shots. Jagged peaks, alpine meadows, maybe some wildlife if I got lucky. The first few days were exactly what I'd hoped for. Stunning views, perfect solitude, and enough cell service dead zones to make me feel properly disconnected. I set up my base camp in a meadow near tree line, planning to use it as a hub for day hikes. It was perfect. A flat spot for my tent, a bubbling stream nearby, and mountains framing every view. That first evening, I photographed the sunset and settled in for the night, feeling completely at peace. I noticed the first stack the next morning. 3 rocks, balanced impossibly on their smallest points, sitting right next to my tent's entrance. I figured I must have been more tired than I thought the night before. Maybe I'd built it myself and forgotten. I photographed it, obviously. It was perfect composition-wise, catching the morning light just right. But when I returned from my day hike, the stack was different. Taller now. 5 rocks instead of 3. I definitely hadn't done that. A bit unsettling, but I reasoned other hikers must have passed through. The spot was beautiful. Why wouldn't someone stop to make art? The third morning, there were 3 stacks. They formed a triangle around my tent, each one higher than the last. The rocks used were massive, some I could barely lift with both hands. The balancing was expert-level stuff, the kind that takes years to master. Part of me was impressed. A bigger part was starting to feel watched. I decided to knock them down before leaving for my hike. It felt disrespectful to destroy someone's art, but the whole thing was getting creepy. When I returned that evening, my heart nearly stopped. 7 stacks now, forming a perfect circle around my camp. The newest ones incorporated pieces of deadwood, creating abstract shapes that somehow looked like they were pointing at my tent. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every snapping twig had me sitting bolt upright, shining my headlamp into the darkness. Around midnight, I heard it, the soft click of stone against stone. I froze in my sleeping bag, barely breathing. The sound came again closer. Click, click, the soft scrape of rock on rock, like someone testing balance points. I wanted to look, but I was terrified of what I might see. The sounds continued for what felt like hours, moving around my tent in a circle. Eventually, exhaustion won out over fear. Dawn broke, and I steeled myself to look outside. The stone circles had multiplied, dozens of stacks now, creating concentric rings around my tent, each one taller than the last. The morning sun caught them just right, making their shadows point directly at my tent like accusing fingers. My hands shook as I packed up camp. This was beyond other hikers having fun. This was methodical, purposeful. As I stuffed my tent into its bag, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Small rocks had been balanced on every single one of my tent stakes, each one perfectly centered. That would have taken hours of painstaking work in the dark. I nearly ran down the trail, but something made me turn back for one last photo. That's when I saw him, a figure standing among the stone stacks, perfectly still. He was tall, lean, wearing what looked like faded hiking gear. As I watched, he lifted a rock larger than my head with one hand, placing it delicately on top of a stack, like it weighed nothing. He turned toward me, but the morning sun was behind him, turning him into a silhouette. "Beautiful morning for balancing," he called out, his voice oddly flat. "Why don't you stay another night? I can teach you." I took off down the trail at full speed, heart pounding. When I reached the ranger station, I tried to explain what had happened. The ranger's face grew serious as I talked. "You camped in Webster Meadow?" she asked, pulling out a map. "Was your site near the old mining ruins?" I nodded, showing her photos on my camera. Her expression darkened at the stone circles. "We've had reports," she said carefully. "Hikers finding stone stacks, always in circles, always getting closer. Last month, a solo camper reported someone stacking rocks around their tent all night, never saying a word." She pulled out an old photograph, yellowed with age. It showed a man standing amid dozens of stone stacks, dated 1987. He looked exactly like the figure I'd seen that morning, down to the faded hiking gear. "This was Dean Webster," she said, "local rock stacking artist. He disappeared up there 30 years ago after spending months building stone sculptures. They never found his body, but every few years." She didn't need to finish. I understood. Some say he's still up there, balancing rocks in ever-widening circles, drawing closer to anyone who camps in his meadow. The rangers eventually posted warnings about camping in that area, citing unstable ground from the old mines. I still go camping, still take photos, but now I knock down any stone stacks I find near my campsite. Some forms of art aren't meant to be appreciated up close, and some artists should be left to practice their craft alone. The strangest part? When I developed my photos from that last morning, the figure wasn't in any of them, but in every shot. The shadows of those stone stacks point to where he had been standing, forming a perfect arrow to an empty space among the circles. Sometimes I wonder if he's still there, balancing impossibly large rocks in the dark, creating his endless circles. And sometimes, when I'm processing my nature photos late at night, I swear I can hear that soft, rhythmic sound click, 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 like stones being balanced just outside my window. Ever hear children laughing in the wilderness when you know damn well there aren't any children for miles? That high-pitched, gleeful sound that makes your skin crawl because it's just wrong? Let me tell you about 3 nights in the Adirondacks that changed how I feel about camping alone. I'd picked a remote spot about 8 miles from the nearest trailhead, the kind of place where you have to really want to be there. It was late September, past tourist season, and I hadn't seen another soul on the trail all day. Perfect conditions for the solitude I was craving after my messy breakup. The first day was exactly what I needed. I set up camp near a small lake, gathered firewood, and spent the afternoon reading by the water. As dusk settled in, I got my first hint that something was off. A child's laugh echoed across the lake, bright, clear, and unmistakable. I sat up, scanning the shoreline. Nothing. No movement, no camps, no signs of life. Must be a bird, I thought. Or maybe the wind playing tricks. The mountains can do weird things with sound. But then it came again, closer this time. A group of children, by the sound of it, giggling like they were sharing some wonderful secret. I checked my map. The nearest campground was 5 miles away, and it was already getting dark. No way there were kids out here. That first night, the laughter kept its distance. Just occasional bursts of it, always when I was about to drift off to sleep. By morning, I'd convinced myself it was just my imagination, or some kind of animal I wasn't familiar with. I spent the second day hiking, trying to shake off the unease from the night before. But as I approached my camp that evening, I heard it again. This time, it sounded like it was coming from right behind my tent. I spun around, nothing. The laughter moved to the other side of camp. Then behind me again. It was like being surrounded by invisible children playing some kind of game. My hands shook as I started my campfire. The sound was clearer now. 3 or 4 distinct laughs, moving around my camp in a circle. Sometimes they'd fade into the distance, only to come rushing back closer than ever. I kept my headlamp on, scanning the trees, but the beams never caught anything moving. Around midnight, it changed. One laugh separated from the others, getting closer and closer to my tent. The giggles turned into words, or something like words, but just distorted enough to be unintelligible. It sounded like a child trying to get my attention, wanting me to come play. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I'd start to drift off, that laugh would come right next to my ear, as if something was pressed against the tent fabric. By dawn, I was a wreck. I should have left then, should have packed up and hiked out. But some stupid part of me needed to know what was going on. I spent the third day setting up trail cameras around my camp. If something was out there, I was going to catch it on film. That third night was the worst. The laughter started at sunset, more intense than before. It wasn't just playful anymore. There was something wrong about it, something hungry. The cameras kept triggering, but every time I checked, they showed nothing but empty forest. Around 2 a.m., I heard something new, the sound of small footsteps circling my tent. The laughter was right there, just inches away, but the footsteps, they sounded wrong. Too heavy for children, almost like something large walking on its hind legs, trying to sound smaller than it was. I lay there, paralyzed, as whatever was completed circle after circle around my tent. The laughter got more frenzied, more distorted. Then suddenly, everything went silent. The kind of silence that feels like a hell breath. That's when my tent pole snapped. Not from wind or weather. Something had grabbed it from outside and bent it until it broke. As the tent started to collapse, I heard the laughing right above me, no longer even trying to sound human. I burst out of that tent like my life depended on it, because I was pretty sure it did. In the beam of my headlamp, I caught a glimpse of something moving in the trees, Something tall and gray. Definitely not a child. And the sounds it was making, I'll never forget them. I ran. Didn't even grab my gear. Just ran down that trail in the dark, the laughter following me the whole way. Sometimes right behind me, sometimes off in the woods, but always there. It finally stopped when I broke through the tree line near the parking area. The next morning, I went back with 2 rangers to get my gear. They'd heard stories like mine before, they said, but never found anything. As we approached my campsite, we heard children laughing in the distance. The rangers froze. Gray fox, one of them said quickly, too quickly. They can mimic human laughter. Probably what you heard, but I saw their faces. They'd gone pale, hands tight on their rifles. We found my tent crushed flat, the metal pole bent at an impossible angle. My trail cameras were all intact, but the memory cards had been destroyed, not removed, not erased, but physically crushed. As we packed up my gear, one of the rangers told me about an old story in these parts, about something that lures people deep into the woods by mimicking children's laughter, something that likes to play with its food before eating it. The locals call them laugh hunters, he said. Most people who hear them are smart enough to leave right away. You're lucky you lasted 3 nights. I still go camping, but never alone and never in that part of the Adirondacks. Sometimes at night, I think I hear children laughing in the distance. Probably just the wind or TV from a neighbor's house, or my mind playing tricks. But sometimes, when it's very quiet, I hear that laugh again, the one that stopped pretending to be human. And I remember what the ranger said as we hurried back to our vehicles. If you ever hear children laughing in the deep woods, don't answer. Don't investigate. And whatever you do, don't laugh back, because then they know you want to play